Hello, everybody. So this is the Urban Sprawl and Land Use lecture. So we started off this unit looking at, with the discussion explaining what your dream home is. And most of you, when I've done this in the past, most of my students always say things about a big house, maybe on the edge of town or something where they can have lots of room with lots of a pool and a basketball court and basically a big home. So very rarely do people talk about having I want a studio apartment in downtown New York. Now that might be for some people, but especially people from around where we are, that's not super common. So I kind of want to start this lecture thinking about where do rich people live, basically. What we see is, pretty much the only people that can completely choose where they want to be and how they want to live are people that have the means to do that, right? And what we see is people that have the money and ability to choose will generally outlive away from a city. They won't live in downtown Chicago, downtown Milwaukee. They, oftentimes are in suburbs and in, big homes with lots of property and lots of things for them to be able to call their own, right? Now what we see is there's a really big shift between what we see here in the US and where people are choosing to live versus what we see in Europe. Now, Europe, what we oftentimes see is a lot of times the coveted place of where people want to live are oftentimes in the city center, like directly in the main part of the city. And sure, there are plenty of people that love to live in downtown New York City, right, Manhattan, but oftentimes that's not the case. So why do we see this big contrast between the US and Europe? And I think, part of what we see is that cities are young in the US, right? We've only had them for maybe 200 years, maybe only 100 years, and these, at the size that they are now. And what we see is cities in the US have been largely unplanned. And there's a big thing is that there's been a lot of pollution in our cities, in the city centers and the waterfronts around the city, and it makes people not want to be there, right? Whereas Europe has had cities for much, much, much longer, hundreds to thousands of years potentially. They've had time to plan, and in some senses, how to remodel the city. The city wasn't originally planned back in medieval times, right? But what we have often seen is a lot of the land in Europe was owned by the nobility, so it stuck people in cities in much more crowded areas. And people were forced to live closely, and it's only been in recent times that they've been able to expand out into more of the countryside. And I thought this was really amazing to me. My wife's family is from Spain, and I was able to go around in lots of different places in Spain, and even in the small towns, what we would expect for people to live in, bigger houses, kind of like what we have here in Whitewater. But really, even in small towns, people are living in very small apartments and very packed in close, even in a town of, just a couple hundred people. So it's really a very different lifestyle. And that's why I kind of wanted to start this conversation thinking about, where your dream home is. Where does it kind of fit in here? And we're going to kind of talk about the consequences of that throughout this lecture and with the podcast that we'll be listening to. So what we see here has happened in the US is people moved basically away from the city center. Right now, if you look at, say, New York or Chicago or even something like Milwaukee, less than 10% of the people actually that work in the city actually live in that city center. So we see a lot of people commuting to the city center, so they work there, but then they get out of there as soon as they can. And what that does is it removes a lot of tax revenue and purchasing power from those people from this city. And what we've seen is in certain cities that has really made the city center decay. So to some extent, Milwaukee is like this. If you go downtown on a weekend at, if you're not near a bar, basically there's nothing going on. Probably the biggest example of this is Detroit, where we see that people have really fled the city. And even, so this is some Google Images pictures, or Google Street View of only like 6 to 7 to 8 years apart, I think. And you can see here the same house over time just decaying, and especially this little red house here. It looks pretty nice here, right? But you would never want to live there now. So what we see is just in less than 10 years, these people moving out of the city has really drastic consequences for the housing and what's actually happening in that city center. Now compare that to then Europe. People have stayed in the city center, and basically what it is in the big cities, especially in like Spain and Italy, and what you have is stores along the bottom of pretty much every street, and then up above you have residential areas. So, and this, these are big apartment complexes, maybe 8 to 9 stories tall, and that could be for the whole big city. Now, what that means then is you can fit a whole lot more people in a smaller area and potentially have, well, that city center is very human impacted, right? There's nothing other than human use of that land, but it saves a lot of the countryside then, so it's not just housing and housing and housing like what we'll have here in the US. Sure, there are congestion problems in the city, but that it's not like we don't have congestion problems in traveling here in the US. What we see is when we have this model of moving out into the suburbs, we see that people are just having to travel more, right? They're having to travel more, they're having to get into their cars, and it's really an inefficient use of space, inefficient use of energy, inefficient use of land. So I think it's really interesting. The greater metropolitan area of Los Angeles, 70% of the land is dedicated to automobiles in some way. So what that is referring to is highways, roads, parking, garages. And so much of the land is just trying to get cars moving around, and that number seems kind of ridiculous, but when you look at this picture here, there's just roads everywhere going, and that is not, I don't know if 70% of our land do I want that to be used to be moving automobiles around. So what we see is people then are not using public transportation, at least in the US, right? So if you look at people that are commuting, 94% of people commute pretty much alone. And then, 6% of the people in the US will get to work some other, either commuting or on a bus or on a train or something. What we see, in the US then is essentially the answer has always been, well, let's just build more roads, right? If you upgrade the roads to make them bigger, better, travel faster, it should alleviate congestion. The thing is, what all research shows is that when we build more roads to get these people moving more quickly from their suburbs into the city center and out and all around, it stimulates growth along those roads. So when you put in a new interstate or something, people go to the interstate and want to use that land, and the roads soon become inadequate. So it's this feedback loop of, okay, build a road to alleviate congestion, which stimulates growth in this area, which makes it congested. So let's build more roads, and essentially you get eventually to a a system where most of your land is dedicated to just moving cars around. Where we see this different then is in a lot of European countries that have invested much more in their train systems. So if you were to go to Switzerland or France or Italy, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking trains around, because their train network is much more developed and moving people around, not just cargo, and it makes it much more efficient, and just efficient for space, efficient for time, and efficient for congestion. That's not to say that there isn't problems with trains and getting people around in a European country or something. It's not always super easy, but for me personally, I would really like to see the U.S. invest more in trains and less in personal automobile use. But we'll have to see how that happens here in the next, I think the next couple of decades will be very interesting, and to see how we move there. The thing is, when we think about urban sprawl, and as we're building our cities out and having less dense populations, it's not just the roads that we should be thinking about, because basically, it's a lot harder to get electricity to people if their houses are all, very spread out. It's hard. You need more electrical lines, you need more gas pipes, you need more sewer lines, you need more water lines, you need everything. So, and what we see is the U.S. is having this aging infrastructure where a lot of the gas lines are somewhere around 100 years old, and especially in cities more out to the east, on the eastern side of the U.S., and we're having more and more problems with that. So the more infrastructure that we have, eventually, the more problems we will also have. So you might ask, well, is urban sprawl actually really a big problem? In the U.S., what are we losing, basically? How much are our cities growing? And what we see is each year we're somewhere losing around 400,000 hectares. That is 1,500 square miles. That's bigger than the state of Rhode Island every year. And what we're losing then is essentially really good agricultural land. The land that is being lost to urban sprawl is generally, closer to the cities, and so it's good for agriculture to be there, because they can get their products out to the cities easier, but it's also desirable to the land developers. So we see this kind of competing tug of war for the land. And basically what we're seeing, though, is a continuous loss of land from either native habitat or agricultural land being turned into then city land, low density city land. So the next lectures we're going to kind of spend thinking about the consequences of these increasing urban areas. So with that, I'll leave you, and hope you enjoyed it.